On the morning of June 29, 2023, in a small town called La Ruana in western Mexico, a 67-year-old lime farmer named Hipólito Mora was driving home when 25 men blocked the road. They opened fire using high-powered rifles, including 50 caliber weapons, reportedly of Barrett type, and kept firing for approximately 30 minutes. Investigators later reported around 1,000 shell casings recovered at the scene. Then, they set the car on fire. 3 bodyguards died alongside him on the same dirt road where 10 years earlier he had decided he was done being afraid. The men who killed him were linked to Los Viagras, a cartel that grew from the ruins of the same movement Mora helped build, fed by the power vacuum it left behind. He had picked up a gun to stop men like this. They had sent 25 of them to make sure he didn't live to see what his revolution had become. 2 years later, they came back for his grave. Gunmen widely blamed on Los Viagras demolished the memorial bust placed over Mora's burial site in La Ruana and left written death threats for his family replace it, and they would be shot. His house would be burned. No one left to protect either. 10 years earlier in the same town, Hipólito Mora had started a revolution. Not a political campaign, not a protest. 60 men with guns on a Monday morning who decided the cartel would no longer decide who could cut a lime, who could drive a road, or who got to come home alive. This is the story of what happened between those 2 mornings and why the revolution ended the same way it began, with a body burning in La Ruana. On September 6, 2006, gunmen stormed the Solway Sombra nightclub in Uruapan, a mid-sized city in the heart of Michoacán's avocado belt. They fired shots into the ceiling, forced the crowd to the floor, and left 5 severed human heads on the dance floor, a deliberate act of public theater designed to be reported, remembered, and feared. Then, they left a cardboard sign. It read, "The family does not kill for pay. It does not kill women. It does not kill innocents. Only those who must die will die. Know that this is divine justice." La Familia Michoacana had introduced itself. The organization had been operating in Michoacán for years, before that night running drugs, moving precursor chemicals through the deep-water port of Lázaro Cárdenas, building international networks for trafficking and chemical supply. But the nightclub was not a criminal act. It was a press release. La Familia wanted Michoacán to know it had arrived, that it had a moral code, and that it had decided who deserved to die. The fact that they were also one of the region's major methamphetamine producers was in their telling beside the point. Their leader Nazario Moreno González, known as El Chayo el Más Loco, once told a Mexican magazine that what he wanted was to regulate the drug trade so that the people are not exploited. He required his members to study his own spiritual handbook alongside American evangelical literature. He considered himself a protector. By 2011, with La Familia fracturing after a federal crackdown, he was officially dead. The government said so. No body was ever recovered. El Chayo would spend the next 3 years running the organization from beyond his own grave. Out of that fracture, the Knights Templar emerged, March 2011. New name, same territory, and even more elaborate mythology. Members were inducted in rituals involving swords, white capes bearing red crosses, and ceremonial props drawn from both medieval imagery and local religious tradition. The Knights Templar distributed a 22-page printed code to their members and to the general public. Its opening line, "Life requires chivalry and humility." They were also charging lime farmers in La Ruana a tax on every kilogram they harvested, a separate fee on every truck they used to transport it, another fee on every packing plant that processed it. A farmer in Michoacán's Tierra Caliente region, the hot country, the agricultural heart of the state, could not plant, grow pickle, or sell his own produce without first paying the Knights Templar for the privilege. Government experts estimated the organization pulled between $800,000 and $1.4 million per week from extortion alone. That figure does not include drugs. It does not include the iron ore they were systematically stripping from the mountains and shipping through Lázaro Cárdenas to China. It does not include the percentage they collected from avocado packers, lime distributors, lemon grove owners, or the large share of legal businesses across the state reportedly forced to make regular payments to avoid a visit. $800,000 a week at minimum, from farmers who needed permission to cut their own fruit. The lime orchards of La Ruana fed families that had worked that land for generations. The trees were old. The work was physical, seasonal, precise. You had to cut at the right moment, or the harvest spoiled. The Knights Templar had inserted themselves into that rhythm with the administrative efficiency of a tax authority. Pay the fee, get the authorization, bring in the harvest, pay the fee again next season. For 7 years, people in Tierra Caliente paid. They paid because the alternative had been made explicit, not always with words, sometimes just with a vehicle parked outside a house overnight, or a son who didn't come home, or a local official who suddenly stopped answering the phone. The federal government had deployed 6,500 troops to Michoacán as far back as December 2006. The troops came. The cartel adapted. The farmers kept paying. Until one morning in February 2013, when a lime farmer in La Ruana decided his son had been told no for the last time. Hipólito Mora was 57 years old, a lime farmer and a man who had never fired a weapon in anger. The Knights Templar had come to his orchard in La Ruana and told his son he could not cut the family's limes without their permission. His son stood on land the Mora family had worked for decades, next to trees his family had planted, and was told by men with guns that the fruit was not his to take. Mora drove into town. He told the men he trusted what had happened. By the next morning, 60 of them had made a decision. On February 24, 2013, armed civilians rose up in La Ruana. Their first action expelled every known Knights Templar operative from the town. Their second detained local police officers and officials accused of working with the cartel. Their third barricades on every road in and out. No shots fired on day one. No one died. 60 people with weapons simply announced that this town was no longer under cartel administration, and the cartel for one morning in one town had no immediate answer. Simultaneously, in the nearby municipality of Tepalcatepec, approximately 80 armed members of a local ranchers association received weapons and white t-shirts reading "Community Police." They expelled their own cartel operatives. They held their own roads. The uprising had two main centers from its first hour, La Ruana, where Mora led the action, and Tepalcatepec, where Dr. José Manuel Mireles and a rancher named Juan José Farias Alvarez, known as El Abuelo, played key organizing roles. Dr. Mireles was 55 years old, a physician who had spent nearly a decade working in California before returning to Michoacán in 2007. The cartel had kidnapped him personally. They had murdered members of his family. He had reached the same conclusion as Mora through a different road. There was no one coming to help. The Mexican government had soldiers in the state for 7 years, and the system had not changed. The cartels had not been weakened. They had simply rearranged themselves. Nazario Moreno, González El Chayo, had been officially declared dead in December 2010. No body. For 3 years, he ran the cartel from beyond his own official death, and the Knights Templar continued to expand under a man the state had already filed paperwork on as a corpse. The cartel had also penetrated significant parts of Michoacán's political and security infrastructure. A leaked phone recording surfaced of Knights Templar leader Servando Gómez Martínez La Tuta, a former elementary school teacher who had graduated to running a regional criminal empire while calling into local television programs, telling a federal lawmaker, "Buddy, first of all, I want you to win. You can count on full support. You are going to win." The lawmaker did not resign. La Tuta was not arrested. The recording simply existed, like so many things in Michoacán, as evidence of a system in which accountability remained slow, uneven, and selective. So the farmers did it themselves. Within months, Autodefensa groups had formed in dozens of Michoacán's municipalities. The movement expelled Knights Templar from towns across the Tierra Caliente places where the cartel had operated so openly that locals could name every operative by face. Farmers who had paid extortion taxes for years showed up at roadblocks in pickup trucks before dawn. Ranchers whose neighbors had disappeared stood guard at highway checkpoints with hunting rifles. For a few months in late 2013, the movement held territory the federal government's soldiers had spent years failing to hold. The Knights Templar, who had built a parallel state complete with a tax system, a code of law, and a mythology of chivalric protection, were running. This was the part that made the international press. The part that got Mireles on television, that brought journalists into La Ruana's lime orchards, that made Mora's face appear on documentary posters in cities he had never visited. 60 farmers, dozens of municipalities. A revolution nobody had organized in advance and nobody in the government had predicted. What no one in La Ruana knew, what would take investigators years to piece together, was that one of the movement's key organizers had not been fighting the Knights Templar for the same reasons as everyone else. Not everyone at the table was fighting the same war. Juan José Farias Alvarez. El Abuelo had been one of the leading organizers of the Tepalcatepec arm of the Autodefensas. He was at the founding. He gave interviews. He stood at the barricades in Tepalcatepec in February 2013. The same morning Mora was organizing in La Ruana. The same white t-shirts, the same white flags, the same language of community protection and cartel resistance. The uprising had two arms from its first hour, La Ruana and Tepalcatepec. What happened in La Ruana that morning was real. What El Abuelo's role would come to mean, authorities would later say, was something else entirely. By every visible measure, he was one of the key organizers of the only civilian uprising in modern Michoacán that had actually pushed a cartel out of a town. Mexican authorities later accused El Abuelo of having aligned with or benefited from CJNG interests during the same period. The Jalisco Nueva Generación Cartel, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Mexican history, run by a man known as El Mencho, had investigators said benefited from the Autodefensas campaign against their rivals. The Knights Templar were CJNG's enemies. A movement that dismantled the Knights Templar's tax system and expelled their operatives was, from CJNG's perspective, useful. El Abuelo, authorities accused, was the connection not necessarily a planted operative from day one, but a man whose interests and CJNG's ran in the same direction long enough to matter. Whether El Abuelo actively coordinated with CJNG from the beginning, or whether the alignment developed over time, has never been established in a Mexican courtroom. What is documented in February 2014? Federal Commissioner Alfredo Castillo, the Mexican government's own security envoy for the Michoacán crisis, publicly stated that El Abuelo had no active arrest warrant. Critics viewed the statement as offering protection to a man investigators would later accuse of criminal ties. The same month, a leaked video surfaced showing Tuta, the Knights Templar leader, meeting in person with a man who had been appointed by the government itself as head of the newly legitimized Rural Defense Forces. The government had formally incorporated the Autodefensa movement into its own security apparatus. The man at the table with the cartel boss held a government appointment. In April 2014, the acting governor of Michoacán, Jesus Reyna, was arrested. Charges he had held meetings with Knights Templar leadership, including Tuta. 1 week before his own arrest, Dr. Mireles sat down for a live television interview. He was denouncing the Mexican president's Michoacán policy, naming names describing the government's failure to prosecute cartel-linked officials when a phone call came into the station. The broadcast was cut, mid-sentence. No explanation was ever given publicly. No one has since identified who made the call. 1 week later, on June 27, 2014, federal agents arrested Mireles in Lázaro Cárdenas. 45 of his men were taken with him. The charge: illegal weapons possession. The man who had organized farmers into the most effective anti-cartel force Michoacán had seen in a generation was processed on a gun charge. He spent nearly 3 years in prison without a formal trial. In 2016, a videotaped statement appeared online, Mireles speaking calmly, urging the remaining Autodefensas to lay down their arms. Mexico's Interior Ministry denied that the government had any role in producing the video. Mireles later confirmed that the statement had been written for him, that he had been required to read it, and that the version broadcast had been edited to remove the context in which he delivered it. The government had used the movement's own founder as a weapon against it. While Mireles sat in the cell, the Knights Templar collapsed. El Chayo, the dead man who had run the cartel for 3 years after his official death, was killed in a second government confrontation on March 9, 2014. Tuta was captured February 27, 2015, after federal agents tracked him to a safe house in Morelia. The Knights Templar were finished. CJNG moved into the vacuum immediately. Security analysts had predicted this outcome before Tuta's handcuffs were cold. The cartel the Autodefensas had spent 2 years dismantling was replaced within months by a larger one. The movement dispersed into the next war, into the next group of armed men calling themselves protectors. Mora himself had been arrested in March 2014 over allegations related to the killings of 2 men following a clash with a rival Autodefensa faction, then released. Later that year, his son was killed in a confrontation involving rival armed groups. He went back to La Ruana. The revolution didn't end. It dissolved, and what it dissolved into is what killed Hipólito Mora. Dr. Mireles was released on May 11, 2017. He had spent nearly 3 years in a Mexican prison without a formal trial. The bond that secured his release, 30,000 pesos, approximately 1,500 American dollars. That was the number the Mexican justice system assigned to the man who had organized the only civilian uprising that had effectively pushed the Knights Templar out of their own territory. The man who had been arrested on a weapons charge while a federal commissioner publicly protected his co-founder's freedom. Not a verdict, not an acquittal that came later in 2018 when the charges were dropped entirely. Just a bond and a door. He told a reporter afterward that Mexico was 10 times worse than when he went in. He died on November 25, 2020, COVID-19. He was 62 years old, only 5 years older than Mora had been when he drove into La Ruana, and told 60 men it was time. Mora had gone back to the orchards. He had run for Congress in 2015 and for governor in 2021 and lost both times. He was a man the movement had made famous, and the political system had no use for a farmer who had done the government's job for it and received arrests and acquittals for his trouble. In June 2023, 10 years after the Autodefensa's peak, he was driving home through La Ruana. 25 Los Viagras sicarios blocked the road. Los Viagras had emerged from the fractured post-Autodefensa landscape. One of the armed groups that formed as the original uprising dispersed different factions, seeking different patrons, until some of them became the thing they had been built to fight. And on June 29, 2023, they ambushed his vehicle, fired hundreds of rounds into it, and set it on fire. The suspected plaza chief responsible, Heladio Cisneros Flores, known as La Sirena Los Viagras man in La Ruana. 3 bodyguards died alongside Mora. His car burned on the same road in La Ruana, where the uprising had started. In November 2025, Mora's nephew and his wife were shot and killed in La Ruana. Mora's family blamed Los Viagras. Authorities presented a conflicting account. The family that had started the revolution was being systematically removed from the town the revolution had been built to protect. In December 2025, Los Viagras came for the memorial bust that had been placed over Mora's grave. They demolished it. They left written threats for his family, put it back, and you will be shot. Your home will be burned. The grave of the man who told the cartel it no longer had permission to exist in La Ruana now belonged to the cartel. El Abuelo Juan José Farias Alvarez, the co-founder who had stood at those same barricades in 2013, was by this point running Cárteles Unidos, a loose coalition of former Knights Templar remnants and ex-Autodefensa factions, now fighting CJNG for control of Michoacán's avocado and lime territories, its port, its highways. In February 2025, the United States designated Cárteles Unidos as a foreign terrorist organization. Los Viagras, a key faction operating within or alongside that structure, has also faced U.S. sanctions. On August 14, 2025, the DOJ announced criminal charges against El Abuelo and 4 other senior leaders and posted a $10 million reward for his arrest. One of the key organizers of the 2013 civilian uprising is now a fugitive wanted by U.S. authorities as a senior leader of a designated terrorist organization. The reward stands. The Knights Templar no longer dominate Michoacán as they once did, their remnants absorbed into newer criminal alliances. The original La Familia Michoacana fractured and dissolved its successors, resurfacing under new names, new flags, the same business. The men who built them are dead or in prison, and Michoacán is still at war. CJNG and Cárteles Unidos are fighting for the same territory. The Knights Templar held the same avocado groves, the same lime orchards, the same port at Lázaro Cárdenas, the same roads through the Tierra Caliente that the Autodefensas once barricaded with pickup trucks and determination. Roughly 4 out of 5 avocados sold in the U.S. come from Mexico, with Michoacán at the center of that supply chain. Many of those avocados travel through supply chains exposed to cartel extortion and violence before they reach a grocery shelf in Chicago or Phoenix or Houston. The farmers growing that fruit still pay. The cartel name on the invoice has changed. The system has not. In La Ruana, the lime trees are still there. The orchards that Mora's family worked for generations still produce fruit in the right season if you cut them at the right moment. The bust over Mora's grave is gone, demolished by Los Viagras. In December 2025, the grave left bare and the family left with a threat. His nephew and his wife were killed in the same town in November of that year. The revolution that started in La Ruana has been methodically erased from La Ruana building by building person by person, stone by stone. Mireles said Mexico was 10 times worse than when he went in. He said that in 2017 to a reporter in El País after 3 years in prison on a weapons charge that was later acquitted for $1,500. He said it having watched the movement he helped build become a pipeline for the next cartel, having read a government-written script on camera, urging his own people to surrender, having seen his co-founder walk free while he sat in a cell without a trial. He died in 2020 without seeing any of it get better. Mora said less. He went back to farming. He ran for office twice and lost. He drove the roads of La Ruana for 10 years after the revolution ended, the same roads, the same town, the same orchards, and was ambushed on one of them in